How's it going, guys? Right now you're watching some my God of War gameplay in the background. This time around I really wanted to talk about my own dreaming of the next God of War. This is also my 2000 subscribers special video. Now that the new God of War is out into the wild and fans across the world has had a chance to enjoy and possibly even to play through it. So the next big question is, what's next? Well, this time around, let our wildest dreams and imaginations wild and just run free. With some background research and a whole heck of a lot of guesswork, I'm going to go ahead and envision the next entry in this ever improving series. Just don't expect the game to come out anytime soon, probably not even on this console generation. So, obviously there's going to be a little bit of spoilers, so be aware. It's been already a month or more even since then, so I think you should expect it anyway. So let's get into the meaty greedy. After killing Baldur and finally getting the opportunity to take the ashes of Atreus' mother to the highest peak of Jotunheim, the godly father and a son duo experienced some major revelations. Atreus' mother Freya was a giant originally from Jotunheim, making Atreus part Greek god, certainly not Aesir god like Thor or Vanir god like Freya, and part giant. Freya, or the other giant, had the ability to see into the future and knew that she would die and Kratos and Atreus would go on this journey with her ashes and end up exactly where they did at the end of the game. All of this information was etched across the stone walls leading to the highest peak in the realm, but the revelations didn't stop there. In the final panel that only Kratos sees, it appears that Kratos, or perhaps some another man, he didn't seem to have Kratos' red tattoos, will die in Atreus' arms in the future. Atreus is seen screaming, possibly with some sort of energy or force flowing from his mouth. Minutes later, we find out that Atreus is actually Loki, the trickster god who is in Norse mythology is responsible for Baldur's death, initiation of the Ragnarok, and essentially the end of the Norse pantheon and rebirth of the world. Though God of War borrows from Norse mythology liberally, it can be assumed that the death of the Baldur at the end of this game largely with the Atreus' involvement. With Signal Ragnarok in later games, what that means that Kratos and Atreus is uncertain, but there appears to be definitive possibility that Kratos will eventually die and Atreus will take over as a series protagonist. This relationship between father and son is key throughout the new God of War, and losing Kratos could prove too devastating to Atreus. Their parental dynamic was mirrored by Baldur and Freya's dysfunctional relationship and may again be mirrored in future games, possibly positioning Odin and Thor as a future mirror to Kratos and Atreus. The new God of War curiously kept the number of Norse gods to a minimum, mostly introducing minor gods and figures that aren't widely known in a pop culture consciousness. Yes, Baldur and Freya, who's possibly an amalgamation of the character Freya and Frigg from the Norse mythology, are decently major, and the World Serpent is supposed to kill Thor during Ragnarok, but even they aren't well known to the general public. You know which Norse gods are Thor, Odin and Loki? The secret ending of God of War, which can be seen by return to Kratos' cabin after beating the game, shows 1 year pass with Thor arriving at their doorstep with raging lightning in his wake. After the credits roll, Atreus says he saw this in a dream, so while this may or may not be canon, it's clear the future of the series looks to integrate the more major gods. Heck, in that scene alone, both Thor and Loki are accounted for, meaning the only huge figure in Norse mythology we haven't seen in the flesh is Odin himself. Using Odin and Thor's relationship as another mirror of Kratos and Atreus' relationship could work wonders in this new game. In this most recent God of War, it wasn't revealed until the later part of the game that Freya and Baldur's mother and this parent-child dynamic is used to reflect Kratos and Atreus' relationship, wherein the protagonists managed to work through their struggles. These antagonists did not. The pain or lack thereof that Freya caused Baldur resulted in a destructive dynamic that ultimately sent both characters over the edge and Baldur to his grave. In the next game, the way Odin and Thor interact with one another could very well tell an entirely different story. A son looking to get out of his father's shadow, or a father attempting to withhold his own power from his son, could very well play into the next game's narrative. These themes could also be used with Kratos and Atreus, especially with a teenager or even adult Atreus in the future. Their father and son dynamic has a lot of places it can go. My bet is that the next God of War will be all about clashing with Thor. I believe this is not the only because he shows in that secret ending, but because he feels initially absent from this most recent game. It's likely Odin will show up too, but this has the vibe of a new trilogy, one that needs a solid beginning, which we already gotten, a middle and end. It's naturally progression, then it started with the lesser brother that is a Baldur. We'll continue with the golden boy Thor and climax with Odin in the throes of the Ragnarok. Much like God of War 3 ended with a battle between Kratos and Zeus, Freya is sure to be involved as well and likely to be a thorn in Kratos' and Atreus' side throughout the next game or two. Other lesser gods and creatures from Norse mythology are bound to be involved as well, and even if there isn't as sprawling of a pantheon as in Greek mythology here, there is still a lot of lore to pull from. Mix that with Kratos' possibility of dying at the end of the next game at the hands of Thor, or you'll have stunning conclusion with Atreus going after Thor's father, Odin, in the final game. Of course, this is all a conjecture and is plausible guesswork at that. Yes, Kratos and Loki has already traveled a lot of realms, but there's still a lot of ground to cover in upcoming games. It's almost a sure thing that Midgard will be used again, as it's essentially the Earth realm in Norse mythology. Though don't expect Santa Monica to just retreat the old ground they already did in the Lake of the Nine, surrounding the Tyr's temple. More areas across the Midgard are sure to be uncovered and traveled to. And like this last God of War, it will probably house the majority of the next game's content. Helheim is also likely to make a return, not only because God of War series is obsessed with sending Kratos to the underworld, but because Hel is a character in and of herself, just like Hades was for the Greeks' mythology. Sure, she's supposed to be Loki's daughter, but so does the servant. And something tells us Santa Monica aren't about to retcon this conception into their narrative. The massive bird off in the distance of Hell isn't interacted with at all in God of War. And though we aren't sure exactly which character this might relate to in Norse mythology, it may have something to do with one of the three cocks that crow, singling the end of the world with the Ragnarok. With so many Norse stories intertwining with the Hell, it's surefire thing that it will return as a location in the future. Alfheim was the first non-Midgard realm Kratos and Atreus traveled to, and while they spent quite a bit of time there, there's a reason to believe they'll make a return in the future. After restoring the light of the Alfheim, Kratos and Atreus successfully drive the Dark Elves from the realm, for the most part, but one of the Dark Elves leaves with a warning, saying that Kratos and Atreus have made a mistake and picked the wrong side. It's possible that the duo will find in the future that this realm should have been controlled by the Dark Elves after all. Even if they didn't, if the player returns to the Alfheim in the news God of War after the credits roll, Mimir will mention that the war between the Light and Dark Elves is constant, and it's likely we'll see this continue in the future. Muspelheim and then Niflheim are unique locations in God of War, and they are totally optional and can't be accessed unless the player finds 4 ciphers for each realm. Once they've done that, they can be accessed through the Bifrost. Muspelheim is essential an arena world with 6 tiers of difficulty and many different challenges. It's a good excuse for extra and specific combat encounters and could act in a similar function in the future. Niflheim is a largely randomly generated and honestly kind of a pain to deal with due to its odd mechanics. Just don't know we'll see Niflheim and its obnoxious mists of same form in the future. But there are multiple Norse tales that take place in a realm, so it could be visited in a greater capacity in the future God of War games. Jotunheim is the land of the giants, is briefly visited at the end of the God of War. It's desolated and empty, devoid of life or any sort of challenges. It exists in the game solely as a narrative beat, and while it's very interesting in that regard, it doesn't seem like a place where much more would go down. Of course, there's still a well of source material to draw from in regards to the Jotunheim of Norse mythology, so it could return in a more active fashion. There are 3 of the 9 realms left totally unexplored in God of War: Asgard, Vanaheim, and Svartalfheim. Hoping I'm pronouncing that right. Anyway, Asgard and Vanaheim are sure to be major locations in the future God of War games, as they are realms of the Aesir and Vanir respectively, and Kratos and Atreus not joining there is highly unlikely. Asgard could end up being Mount Olympus of this era of the God of War and be major location for a final game where Kratos and or Atreus face down many of the major Aesir left standing, specifically Odin. Vanaheim seems like likely location for Kratos and Atreus to spend a lot of time during the next game, and could see the duo siding with the Vanir in a war against the Aesir. Even if Kratos doesn't trust any gods regardless, Svartalfheim on the other hand is home to the dwarves and perhaps even the dark elves, and it likely to be visited as well. In fact, all 3 realms show up as a location within the Bifrost, but aren't accessible due to Odin's interference. You can bet on these places showing up in the future. Yggdrasil, the ash tree that connects all 9 realms, is in God of War, but just barely. It's involved in a Bifrost, is used during fast travel, and was used by Tyr to hide access to Jotunheim, but being such a major pillar of Norse mythology, expect it to return. There are also other locations and even mythologies references in God of War, including a desert land that sure sounds like Egypt, during a scene that discusses the goddess of war in the different areas of the world. Something that looks like an eye of Horus is shown, though Horus was not in the gods of war in Egyptian mythology. This could even mean more mythologies will be involved in the God of War series. We think it's more likely to other mythologies will be explored after Norse mythology is wrapped up, much like Greek mythology was after the original game, but only time will tell. Though story and setting will be paramount to the future of the God of War, gameplay will remain its primary factor of success. The new God of War dramatically changes the way the series plays, placing the camera just behind Kratos' shoulder, giving control of the camera directly to the player. It also switched out his Blades of Chaos for Leviathan Axe, at least for the first third of the game. It opened up the structure of the series to allow more optional content into the game than main story material, and gave the player RPG elements to leverage this freedom brilliantly. All of the things more will continue into the future of the God of War games, but more ingredients will inevitably be added to the mix. The behind-shoulder camera perspective will almost certainly stay for the indefinite future of the God of War. It also allows for personal, aggressive combat, and its inclusion has few detractions since the game's release. It can cause a bit of confusion as the camera does have tendency to cut enemies behind Kratos off the screen, even though they're about to attack him. There are of course the danger indicators that work well, but this minor issue is sure to be reduced even further in the next God of War. Adding in more weapons with each new entry in as a God of War tradition, and the next game in the series is likely to have more than just Blades of Axe. Once the Blades of Chaos are obtained in the newest God of War, the two weapons balance each other beautifully. It's unlike, however, Santa Monica will rely solely on those two weapons in the God of War. Even if they do work exceptionally well as a fire and ice close mid-range duo, weapons like the Bow of Apollo from the God of War 3 added to range to combat, and the Blade of Olympus starting in the God of War 2 gave Kratos a close-up weapon for destruction to unleash on his foes. Though we fully expect Santa Monica to get even more mileage of the Blazing Axe, we anticipate even more variety in the future releases. The openness of a God of War has been noted by critics and fans alike, but we think that this is just the beginning. God of War is unlikely to go fully open world, and we like it that way. This new game offered a great balance of story, gameplay and optional content, and a structure that the game employs could very well be replicated for a sequel. As the game progresses, the Lake of the Nine's water levels lower more and more, opening up even more areas for Kratos and Atreus to explore. This lends to Metroidvania-like structure where players regularly return to previously discovered locations after major story beats and acquired new weapons abilities that let them go places and open things they previously couldn't. The sequel is likely to retain these traits but will possibly branch away from the Lake of the Nine, unless they undergo some major change to make the rediscovery of its various areas interesting for a fourth or fifth time around. The next God of War will likely pick up exactly where the last one left off. With Thor and Kratos and Atreus' doorsteps, this will remind players of Baldur's appearance at the beginning of God of War, but with much more explosive entrance. Instead of the contemplating of the deliberately slow introduction that we got from Frigg's cremation, Thor will opt to immediately try to kill Kratos and abduct Atreus. Baldur, Thor's half-brother, was taken from him by Kratos, and his revenge aims to be final. Kratos instructs Atreus to return to the house, and though he first argues, Atreus ultimately complies. Players will be reintroduced to combat mechanics during the first opening battle, first with Kratos summoning the Leviathan axe to his hand during the first phase of the fight. After taking a beating from the God of Thunder, Atreus delivers the Blades of Chaos to Kratos and he brandishes them once again, turning the tide of the fight. Eventually, Thor destroys their house, though Atreus manages to save Mimir from inside just in time. Recognizing he's losing the fight, Thor grabs hold of Atreus and flees towards the Bifrost. It appears that he wants to take Atreus to Asgard for unknown reasons. Kratos makes chase and the conflict continues to escalate across the wild woods, eventually bringing the fight to the Lake of the Nine. The lake, like the rest of Midgard at this point, is completely frozen due to the weather shift that signaled the beginning of the Ragnarok. Kratos catches up and he and Thor clashes across the frozen lake, but Kratos quickly loses the upper hand and Atreus is knocked unconscious. Just as Thor is about to deliver a final blow to Kratos, Jormungandr appears and aims to kill Thor. These two now fight endlessly, and with the serpent, a massive scythe, the battle faded off into the distance. Removed from the precious little protection the wild woods gave, Kratos and Atreus are quickly surrounded by an army of the dead. The problem that began during the last game has escalated, and though the spirits of the Valkyrie has been freed, their role in guiding righteous soul to Valhalla, which resides within the Asgard, is no longer tenable, and the souls are flooding Midgard. Mimir suggests they might make the Bifrost immediately and travel to another realm to escape, so Kratos picks up Atreus and makes for the center of the lake. Upon reaching the central chamber, Mimir notes that somebody has recently used it to travel or from to Vanaheim, which had been locked during the last game. With few other options and an army of the dead knocking at their door, they travel to Vanaheim. Upon their arrival, they find a much different world than the frozen wasteland that was Midgard. Just as it was shown in Freya's magical window, Vanaheim is beautiful, lush, and magical flora and fauna. However, both Atreus and Mimir sense that it's not all is well. Leaving the Bifrost chamber, the trio are quickly ambushed by a group of Vanir. Being generally peaceful gods, Mimir is confused as the action, but is able to convince the mysterious group to lay down their weapons and escort the trio to the realm's major palace. In natural and a wondrous land, the Vanir home are one of the large root of Yggdrasil. Kratos and Atreus and Mimir meet with Freya's twin brother. It appears that she managed to somehow return to Vanaheim, which she had previously been restricted by Odin to enter ever again. She came to strike a deal with Frey, but negotiations fell apart as the Vanir no longer trust Freya. Freya, as the rest of the Vanir, recognizes that Ragnarok is just the beginning, and knowing the future, they are doing everything in their power to stay out of their coming conflict. They don't want Kratos bringing danger to their doorstep, but they see the threats that Freya, Odin, and Thor pose, and decided to use the trio to do their dirty work by proxy. Freya bestows his magical sword to Atreus, recognizing his lineage and showing his respect for the diseased fire. From this point on, Atreus becomes a second playable character. The player can freely swap between controlling Kratos and Atreus with the push of a button. When one is being controlled, the other is taken over by an advanced AI. As before, Kratos can command Atreus to fire arrows, but now Atreus can command Kratos to attack enemies while he's being controlled as well. Atreus' sword and bow act as close range and long range weapons and greatly different from Kratos' blades and axe. Just as Kratos' blades and axe deal fire and ice damage, Atreus' arrows still come in electric variety, but the light embodiments are now exclusive to his sword. He controls much like Kratos does, but is nimble and light. He can jump on command, aiming his bow in mid-air if desired. He has far less defense and health than Kratos. The two complemented each other well, and their weapons created a great foursome dynamic that makes dispatching certain enemies at a specific time more strategic and entertaining. From this point on, Kratos and Atreus regularly return to Vanaheim as a sort of central hub, much like the Lake of the Nine was used in the most recent game. Optional tasks from the Vanir will be given to the player, many of which take place in Vanaheim, though some will take player to other realms. Vanaheim is gorgeous but varied, with many environments including lush forests, desolated deserts, and cavernous mountains. The dwarves, Brock and Sindri, return. Though Brock is currently alone in Vanaheim, it appears that Sindri has returned to Svartalfheim, the home of both the dwarves and the dark elves. Access to the world, however, has been reserved, and even Brock cannot return with his unique powers. He refuses to show it, but he is desperately concerned about his brother and does everything in his power to convince Kratos and Atreus to find a way there and makes sure Sindri is alright. Like the last game, from this point on, Brock will somehow show up in various locations, fully set up with his blacksmith shop. Armor, weapons, rune, upgrades all still exist in this new God of War and functions similarly to how they did in the previous game. Hacksilver is still a currency, and upgrades require other more specific materials you gain throughout your travels. New to this game is a recipe system where after beating certain enemy, specifically bosses with armor, Kratos and Atreus gain recipes for the new armor and runes, and they can take to Brock and make this new equipment for themselves, if they have sufficient materials, obviously. Many of these pieces can only be made by beating optional bosses, enemies, further inconveniencing of the incentivizing optional quests. Because Atreus is now a playable character, he has just as many upgrading opportunities as Kratos, including full armor set, the ability to equip runes, and full skill tree for each of his weapons. With one tree specifically tied to his acrobatic abilities, which can increase his jump height, duration, and slow down time when aimed in midair, all runes can be used by either character, but armor and weapons upgrades are unique to each. The Blade of Chaos and Leviathan Axe can now be upgraded using two types of resources, one unique to each weapon and one shared by both. Meaning, players have to decide which weapon they want to upgrade over the other when they obtain this material. The same goes for Atreus' bow and sword, thus customizing each character's more in the player's hands even ever before. As per Brok's wishes, Kratos, Atreus and Mimir begin to look for a way to access Svartalfheim, and the only way they have to go on is that the war between the light and the dark elves has reignited in the Alfheim, meaning that the dark elves are somehow getting from Svartalfheim to Alfheim. Frey, being the guardian of the Alfheim, accompanies the tree in hopes of ending the war peacefully. They take a Bifrost and finds that things are worse than they could have ever imagined. The Light Elves, once seemingly peaceful, have become excessively violent, and Freya seems to be one of them leading them. She has once again become the Queen of the Valkyrie and has taken the bloodlust in the wake of Baldur's death. She's gone as far as siding with Thor and Odin once more, which explains her abilities to leave Midgard. The Dark Elves, on the other hand, also have the powerful being leading their charge, the great wolf Fenrir. Fenrir is intelligent but bloodthirsty, and desires nothing more than to kill Odin. He wants Kratos and Atreus dead as well, meaning both the Light and Dark Elves are gunning to kill the player. The light of the Alfheim constantly shifts from light to dark, as the balance of battle is unstable and neither of the sides have upper hand. Eventually, after defeating one of the leaders of the Dark Elves, Atreus obtains Dark Arrows, which are highly effective against Light Elves and other creatures of light that have been turned by the Aesir. Freya and Fenrir both confront the trio at the same time, resulting in a major clash between all three parties, creating a dynamic and hectic boss battle. Frey uses his Vanir magic to try and bind Freya while the player escapes Alfheim. Just as they near the Bifrost, Thor intervenes and begins a fight with the player. This fight is short-lived, as Fenrir appears at the begins to viciously attack Thor. Knowing that Fenrir is capable of killing Odin, Thor flees with Fenrir in pursuit. The trio takes Bifrost back to the Vanaheim, knowing that the Aesir cannot follow them there, even if Freya can. This initiates a brief respite in the story, allowing players to partake in even more optional content of Vanaheim if they wish. Brok approaches the trio, asking about Sindri, though they have no news to give him. Frustrated, Brok leaves to find his own way to Svartalfheim. If the player chooses to continue the story, they'll discover that Brok has learned of a way to reach Svartalfheim, but it involves breaching Yggdrasil itself. Kratos refuses, fearing this could destabilize the Nine Realms, and claiming this matter none of his business. But Atreus refuses to leave Sindri in danger. Mimir does not know which side to take, and small rift between Kratos and Atreus begins to form, though their love is still strong. Freyr returns from the Alfheim severely injured, unable to stand upright on his own. He barely survives the fight with his sister, and convinced she will be unable to seize her desire for vengeance on Kratos and Atreus. Freya knows the light of the Light Elves and Alfheim are now in Freya's control, and decides that the only way to Vanir could ever defeat Aesir is to side with the Dark Elves and Fenrir. Thus he implores Kratos and Atreus to take Brok's advice and enter Yggdrasil in order to reach Svartalfheim. The foursome, including Brok, are granted access to the roots of the Yggdrasil by Frey and begin on a long and difficult journey. The inside of the tree is made up of a splendid crystals, and all of them elements including fire, ice, electricity, light, and dark exists within the tree. And many new enemies appear. Variations of enemies that players have seen before, like drugs, trolls, elves, and more, are imbued with the crystal here, and are more powerful than ever. These crystals become their weak points for Kratos and Atreus to focus on. It revealed that any creature or god or mortal remains within Yggdrasil for too long, they will become corrupted with these crystal powers and can never leave. Thus, the foursome proceeds the more speed than ever before, eventually reaching the Svartalheim in one piece. Expecting a war-torn, desolated and dark climate, Svartalheim is surprisingly beautiful and somewhat peaceful. The dwarves and dark elves coexist in peace, and Sindri has been revealed be just fine. He's been crafting weapons and armor for the elves alongside the other dwarves. He apologizes to Brock for leaving without a word, but because Brock had been banished from the realm, he went without him, and hadn't left the realm since because he was focused on his blacksmithing. The dwarves attempt to imprison and execute Brock, resulting in a massive fight between dwarves, Kratos, and Atreus. Eventually they fight the king of the dwarves, and upon defeating him, Brock is granted the right to return to Svartalheim. Brock and Sindri remain with the dwarves, but still show up randomly at the small blacksmith locations to aid the player. They also reveal their brother Atreus, a bit of known at all that can improve the player's equipment in ways his brothers cannot. Kratos and Atreus and Mimir make their way to Fenrir's cave, far within the cavernous mountains. After fighting though many foes, including hundreds of dark elves, they reach Fenrir. He's been injured by Thor, but is still a deadly opponent, and a boss fight ensues. Just before dealing a death blow to Fenrir, Kratos implores Atreus to hold his fire. Atreus, filled with rage and adrenaline, very nearly disobeys his father's advice. But seeing the fear in Kratos' eyes, he holds back. They then strike a deal with Fenrir, and Vanir Dark Elves, Fenrir Dwarves, and the trio are now on the same side against Aesir, Light Elves, Freya, and Army of the Dead. A war is brewing, and clear Ragnarok is approaching. The player now reaches a new point in which more side quests options are available, both in Vanaheim and Svartalheim. If the player decides to continue with the story, they'll initiate a major war between light and dark, on which they are on the dark side. Though it appears that their party is in the right to try and stop the light side from bringing runes to all the 9 realms, along with the massive army behind them, the player returns to Alfheim for all-out war. Bloodshed is everywhere, with each race tearing one another apart. Kratos, Atreus, and Mimir set off to face Freya and Thor directly. A major fight ensues, with Frey and Fenrir assisting in a battle that spans the entire realm and even manages to make its way into Yggdrasil. The tree itself begins to attack all within. Frey and Freya breaking off into their own fight. Fenrir deals with the tree, and Kratos, Atreus, Mimir, and Thor end up back in the frozen Midgard. Their battle is intense and fought with electricity, thunderbolts rain from the sky, and the players loses the upper hand. Ultimately, the voice of Odin pulses at the atmosphere, advising Thor to end his attempt to abduct Atreus and instead kill him. Thor managed to smash Frey's magic sword into pieces. Just as Thor is to deal a death blow to Atreus, Kratos throws himself into harm's way, and Thor hammer Mjolnir becomes deeply lodged within Kratos' chest. Filled with anger, Atreus enters a state of Spartan rage for the first time, frightening Thor. He attempts to flee, but Atreus is too fast, furiously firing off dark arrows in Thor's direction. Thor attempts to call Mjolnir and will not come. Atreus catches up with Thor and pins his hands and feet down with dark arrows. About to loosen an arrow into Thor's skull, Mimir speaks from nearby, still hanging on Kratos' waist, and implores Atreus to weight his actions before killing Thor. He does so anyway. Atreus returns to Kratos, who lies on a lake bleeding out with the Mjolnir in his chest, pinning him into the ice. He says that it's too late and that nothing can save him now. He's off to find Faye, as well as his slain first wife and child in the afterworld. Atreus refuses to let his father go and manages to pull Mjolnir out of the Kratos with ease. Kratos tells Atreus that he's proud and that he loves him. He proceeds to breathe his last breath. Atreus holds Kratos in his arms and screams out of rage and grief, and swears to avenge his father's death by killing Odin. Atreus collects his father's body and belongings, as well as his broken sword, placing Mimir on his own hip, and takes him back to their destroyed home in the wild woods, which is now overrun with the undead. Their fear Mjolnir, which Atreus swings with furiousity. He uses the same pyre that his mother was, cremated on his turn of Kratos to ash. He takes these ashes with him and travels once more to Jotunheim. After spreading these ashes at the peak, more of a mural is unveiled to Atreus. He now sees the panel that shows his father's death, but he also sees more. He sees himself travel to Asgard and confront Odin, though in the end the mural shows Odin killing him. Mimir implores Atreus to change his course, but he does not listen. The dwarf brothers appear and offer their condolences, though they are impressed and confused by Mjolnir's choice to give his allegiance to Atreus. They offer to take Kratos' blades of chaos and Leviathan axe and make them into braces that Atreus can wear, as well as fashion the broken sword into new light arrows. He accepts, and powers within Kratos, all weapons are now given to Atreus, including the options to use ice and fire attacks. All of the Kratos XP is also transferred to Atreus, allowing players to unlock some more expensive abilities they likely couldn't before. Still, grief sticking, not knowing what to do. Atreus decides not to go to Asgard or to return to Alfheim to end the battle, but instead he travels to Hel to speak with his father. Upon reaching Hel, Atreus finds a horrific scene: the lost soul of humans, light and dark elves, dwarves killed, gods and more still fighting, creating an intense, difficult atmosphere. Eventually, Atreus and Mimir make their way into a massive bird that resides in Hel. Atreus takes it on a major battle that spans Hel and eventually kills it. Soon after, the goddess Hel reveals herself and is enraged at Atreus' actions. The two fight, and Atreus murdered her as well. He demanded she tell him where his father's spirit is with her last breaths. And she reveals that even with Valkyrie gone, Kratos must have been powerful enough to make it to Valhalla on his own. Atreus now knows his path forward. He returns to Alfheim to find only death and corpses strewn about the land. He makes for Vanaheim and discovers the Aesir have managed to breach its magical barriers after Freya's killed Frey. The fighting was brutal, though some of the Vanir survived, telling the players that the Aesir returned to Asgard. Atreus makes the Yggdrasil and finds that Fenrir is still fighting the tree. After a major battle, Atreus begins to destroy Yggdrasil from the inside of the Mjolnir, tearing apart the fabric that ties the 9 realms together, and proceeds to Asgard. Despite constant warning from the Mimir, they end up in the entrance of Asgard. Atreus, filled with rage and single drive to kill Aesir and find his father's spirit in Valhalla, which resides within the Asgard. He tells Mimir to call him Loki, and the two enter Asgard. This new God of War would be titled God of War Yggdrasil, and would come out of some time after the PlayStation 5 hits the market. It sets up a third and a final game called God of War Ragnarok, which will parallel God of War 3 in many ways, including Loki's lust for vengeance and journey to murder every god in their own land. Though it took Sony Santa Monica 5 years to make the most recent God of War, this one will take slightly less, at the 3 or 4 years. Despite being on a new system, the game will run on the same engine that God of War did, which helps with the development significantly. Cory Barlog will not be at the helm, as he'll be off making a new IP for Sony, but he will oversee its story and overall production as a producer. The themes of the game are light and darkness, blurring the lines between what's right and wrong, good and evil. The game is still very much about the relationship between father and son, but now Atreus is a teenager, and the difficulties in his relationship of the between himself and Kratos stems from his narrow-mindedness and inability to see the world from a wider perspective. Just before Kratos dies, he and Atreus have a major fight, and Atreus is distraught that they did not resolve their conflict. Ashamed at himself for how it ended, this all further fuels his rage in the God of War, Ragnarok. The future of the God of War is bright, and while Sony Santa Monica may eventually delve into something like an Egyptian mythology, their focus is squarely on the Norse mythology for this trilogy. Sony Santa Monica has a lot of hype to live up to it with the future installments, and even if it doesn't even remotely resemble as I've laid out here today, they're sure to make this sequel bigger and better than ever before. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. Tell me down in the comments what you think about this future my story sort of thing. Anyway, I'll see you guys there. Have an awesome one. Have a good one. See you guys.